Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 272 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the current state of science fiction podcasting and exploring what science fiction podcasters can learn from public radio. And I'm joined by two guests. So first up, we've got Rose Eveleth. Her writing has appeared in BBC Future, Motherboard, and Best American Science Writing, and her radio background includes stints at WNYC and WNYU. She's a former editor of the Story Collider podcast, and she also produced the first season of the 30 for 30 podcast for ESPN. She also hosts Flash Forward, a podcast about the future. So Rose, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. 200 and what? That's so many episodes.
272.
272. Wow, congratulations. That's amazing.
Thank you. And also joining us today is Eric Molinsky. He worked for over a decade for PRI's Studio 360, and his work has also appeared on Morning Edition, All Things Considered, Marketplace, and the New Yorker Radio Hour. He also hosts Imaginary Worlds, a bi-weekly podcast about science fiction and other fantasy genres from Slate's Panoply Network. So Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here. And yeah, I'm pretty blown away by the amount of episodes you've done as well.
Well, my episodes are easier to produce than you guys' episodes are, and we'll talk about that. But the first thing I wanted to ask you, Eric, is actually I was just listening to an interview with you, and you were talking about when you were working in public radio, or when working in public radio, how you have been pitching fantasy and science fiction related topics. And they've done a couple of them, but they haven't wanted to do as many of them as you were interested in. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think it was probably talking about working on Studio 360, which, I mean, at WNYC, or it was, actually now it's a part of Panoply. But I mean, there could not be a show that would be, more open to sci-fi fantasy stuff than Studio 360. But even then, I was just saying how I felt kind of limited by, how much they're willing to go into. And as they often used to remind me, too, that the people listening to the show very often would not be very, very well versed in what I was talking about. And I sort of I felt like I often had to keep justifying why we were talking about this on public radio. And I always found with other public radio shows or like NPR, when they would cover this kind of stuff, they absolutely had to mention how much money these movies were making or how many viewers this TV show just to justify why they were talking about it. And I remember that frustrated me a lot.
Well, right, because my parents are big public radio listeners. They pretty much always have it on when they're home. And so I've listened to a lot of it kind of in the background, but I never got into it so much because I was always so interested in science fiction and video games and stuff, and I felt like there wasn't much of that on public radio, or if there was, it wasn't from the perspective of a hardcore fan or somebody who was really passionate about it or something.
Yeah, and I also, just to interrupt for a second, I also felt like public radio rarely talked about the issues within science fiction and fantasy and the kind of just really interesting, in-depth conversations that the fans were having about this kind of stuff. That there always seemed to be sort of a barrier to it because they imagine, if they're all talking about Star Trek, everybody must be in their parents' basement with Spock ears or something. Like that's kind of the stereotype that I think stopped them from sometimes taking this stuff as seriously as they take the other arts and culture that they cover so well in public radio.
Yeah, but
Do you think that's changed? I'm sorry. I'm doing that rude thing where like I start asking questions of the guest. But I'm curious, because Harry Potter is so popular, right? Like Harry Potter, and now we've got, there are all these big blockbuster movies that are, seem like maybe infiltrating the mainstream culture, and they're making new Star Trek movies. I mean, do you feel like that has changed at all in your 10-year stint did that needle move at all?
I gotta say, I don't think it did much. I mean, I did not see a lot of people other than myself, frankly, and very often I had to keep adding in these justifications I didn't want to have to do, to just take it as to take it as seriously as the fans did. I mean, I guess one thing that I think has changed, for example, is we did this hour-long episode of American Icons about Superman, I think back in 2006. And when that first went on, I mean, we got so much flack from listeners. Like, they could not believe we spent an hour seriously talking about Superman. And I don't think, now 11 years later, I mean, they replayed that episode so many times. I don't think they've gotten any complaints in a while about it. The idea that how dare you spend an hour talking about Superman on public radio? How can my money be going towards this? So I think that's a way that the needle has definitely moved a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, if there are any public radio people listening to this, I mean, you have at least one person here who would like to hear more of that kind of stuff on public radio. I recognize that I'm not exactly a representative sample of the general population, but I feel like there have to be a lot of people like me out there who would want to hear this stuff on public radio.
It does feel like public radio in general is almost never, no matter what you're a fan of, like they're never really aimed at the super fans of anything, right? Because they are trying to be so general and trying to hit like every possible market audience. And that is like a frustrating thing about mass market anything, right? Where, I'm a sports fan too. And like the way that NPR covers sports is honestly laughable because they just assume that you don't know anything. Like they're like, what is sports ball? Like they do that for almost everything. And I feel like actually sports is an interesting analogy because it is sort of, I think, inherently taken unseriously in NPR world in the same way that I think fantasy and sci-fi gets lumped into like young adult in a lot of those cases where it's like, oh, this is for kids or, oh, this is for like stupid jocks, And I think that you're getting that changing a little bit, but I feel like a lot of public radio in general, it's just not going to ever be geared towards the super fan of anything. That said, like you don't have to justify why you're talking about, the latest literary novel, even though like how many people are really reading, the 900-page literary novel that just won the award, so it is skewed, but I think that it's probably the case for a lot of topics.
Well, I mean, Rose, I mentioned in your bio that you had sort of internships and jobs and stuff at WNYC and WNYU. Was there ever any discussion of fantasy and science fiction that you observed?
Yeah, I mean, at WNYU, it's very kind of you to put that in there. That is the NYU student radio station. So it's not, I mean, it's great. It's like a super great learning place. I ran a show in which I could do whatever I wanted, but like 7 people probably listened to it, which is totally fine when you're learning. You kind of do want to like be able to do stuff on a very, very small stage. I think that's actually something that is tough in podcast land or sort of in a lot of media now. It's, there's not a lot of small proving grounds like that where you can kind of try weird things and do weird things and then, not have an entire network or an entire station thrown behind you. Now it feels like if you have a podcast with a big network, your first episode is going to go out on every other podcast on that network and there's no margin for error. You can't have 10 episodes that are kind of shitty. Am I allowed to curse on this podcast?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so this isn't public radio. You can curse as much as you want.
Perfect. And so, I mean, I think that that's a hard thing, right? Like getting to work on this science and tech show at WNYU, which like literally nobody really listened to, was great because I made, 50 episodes of a show and I really like kind of got my reps in. Or Radiolab, spent the first couple of years of its existence where like nobody listened to it. So, I mean, I think that's great being at WNYU, but WNYU doesn't have rules in the way that like an NPR station would, right? Like I really could do whatever I wanted. Aside from curse, actually, we did have rules about that. But at WNYC, I was an intern at Radiolab, and they're also sort of almost an exception to the NPR rule in that like whatever Radiolab kind of wants to do, it's sort of allowed to. They're kind of allowed to like get weird. So one of the things I actually worked on when I was there was a short about this court case in which these people were arguing about tariffs and taxes on superhero figurines and whether they are considered toys or dolls, which like seems really weird and obscure, but it sort of got wrapped into this whole conversation because these were X-Men figurines largely, and a doll has to be human and a toy doesn't have to be human, which like is entirely the thing of X-Men, right? Where you have these like mutants and like, are they human? Are they not? And so we did this whole short, really like using this obscure court case and fight over taxes and tariffs to sort of make this weird parallel to X-Men and that universe. And it was really interesting and weird, but that's like the kind of thing you can do when you're at Radiolab that you probably can't do at a lot of other places because the fans will go with you kind of anywhere. And you don't have to do quite as much. I think the big thing you have to do when you work for like a different NPR show or a different show in general is sort of say, okay, well, why are people listening to this? Why do people care? And you do have to answer that at Radiolab, but you also have a little bit of built in, like people will kind of go with you wherever you decide to take them. And the payoff has to be really good, but you don't have to do with a lot of the same explanation up top about like, oh, well, X-Men is a franchise that makes lots of money. Like all of that stuff you have to do on a short for, a more mass market NPR show like Morning Edition or even, Studio 360, which is sort of aimed at an arts crowd. And so it's a little like, it was formative and it was great, but it's also a little bit weird and an exception to the rule in a lot of ways, because you were allowed to, like, we could do a super weird but like delightful little short like that, and nobody was like, we're not getting the Superman comments where people were like, why would you spend 15 minutes on this? This is stupid. People were like, oh, this is a charming little thing,
Well, I agree with what you're saying about how podcasting is more forgiving. I really appreciate that I've been able to do 272 episodes of the show that are all kind of shitty, and it's okay. So I'm getting there.
You need to say that in a self-deprecating British accent. 272 absolutely awful episodes. Thank you for bearing with me.
Yeah, but I can't do a British accent. I'm so hopeless at this. But so Eric, so tell us about. So I mean, in the interview I was listening to, you were saying, that you wanted to go more in depth on the fantasy and science fiction stuff than you could on the radio, and so that's why you decided to get into podcasting. So say a little bit more about like what that was like, just getting your podcast off the ground.
It's funny. I mean, it was totally terrifying at first, and then it was then incredibly disappointing when I realized no one was listening. And why did I think that putting my podcast out there that the entire world would be like, oh my God, here it finally is.
Finally, Eric has a podcast.
Quick.
Well, tell
Blare
us
the trumpets.
Tell us, what was the concept and stuff? Like, how did it, like, even the stuff before you actually released your first episode?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it took me, I knew I wanted a podcast for a while, but it took me a while to figure out what it would be about. And I mean, I used to work a whole part of my background, which I talk about, my backstory, which I talk about a lot of my podcasts, is that I used to work in animation and in LA, and I made this really weird career shift. And so there's this whole very geeky side of me that, I used to joke that in the world of animation, I was like the sophisticated NPR listener guy who was just not at all, I don't know, maybe sophisticated is a little bit too kind, but certainly I felt like Fraser Crane walking around the animation studio. And then I walk into WNYC and I suddenly feel like Kevin Smith. We're just like, where on earth did this guy come from? And so it's amazing that it took so long for me to realize that this was the passion. I kept thinking, well, what is my, in terms of what I talk about, what's my broccoli and spinach versus what's my cake and ice cream? And I realized this was it. And I once I realized that, it was pretty simple. I mean, I knew that I loved putting together my stories for public radio. And the thing that used to frustrate me the most very often is the amount of time that you can get with a public radio piece. I mean, every episode, everything I turn in was usually about 14, 15 minutes. And they'd say, that's great. Now let's make this 6 or 7. And it just felt like I was chopping off limbs to get to that point. And then even still, when you got it to 7, they'd say, this other segment's too long. Can you make it 5:45? And it would be kind of heartbreaking. And so and that was the first thing I remember noticing with Roman Mars with 99% Invisible, which was one of the first big podcasts, was that it sounded like public radio, but he could make it as long as he wanted, which was so liberating for a public radio producer, that I could make a piece 15 minutes or I could make it 25 minutes, however long I felt it should be, which now is, not only is it so normal, but one of the most common questions I get is, why isn't my podcast longer? And I always say, like, you understand, this to me feels luxurious. I like to spend 25 minutes on a single piece. So I knew I just wanted to do a supersized version of my show. And that part was really easy. I think the hardest part beyond that is not having an editor. Because, so often you have an editor who works with you. Not often in the beginning, the editor may approve the story, but then the editor doesn't come back around until you have a script and some tape, and then you get on the phone with them, and you're like reading the script and then putting the phone up to the speaker. And so through their phone, it should sound to them like a very raw version of a public radio story. And then they give you lots of notes, and sometimes you can go through 5 to even 10 drafts like that. And so not having an editor was really strange as well, and something that took a long time to get used to. And so what I would often do is and I still do this, is I try to get my episodes done as early as possible so I can just kind of ruminate on them, and I keep just talking about my inner editor that I'm trying to get in touch with. But eventually I realized my wife also could serve as a great second pair of ears, since she did go to journalism school, even though she went into TV instead of radio. So she also, to some extent, serves as an editor as well. But those are some of the big shifts I had to make.
Where did the name come from?
It was I had such a long list of ideas. I was going to call it suspension of disbelief for a long time. People thought it was too clunky. And my brother, who loves giving people career advice, just thought this whole project of mine was fascinating. And so he was just asking me to ramble. He's like, just ramble. Just describe this podcast to me. And I just started talking about these imaginary worlds, and he just was like, stop, that's your title, Imaginary Worlds. And so that felt like a big accomplishment that day.
So do you see your mandate as anything related to fantasy and science fiction, or like where do you draw the line of stuff you wouldn't cover on your podcast?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm actually going to do 2 episodes coming up about concept albums. And these musicians who are writing a sci-fi fantasy concept album wrote and asked if I'd be interested in, doing something about that. And I was like, oh my God, that's great. And I had to decide then, where do I draw the line? And it definitely has to have some fantastical element to it. It doesn't necessarily have to be fantasy, but it just needs to be fantastical. And I hope in the future to broaden that even more so. But there needs to be something. It can't, because I looked at some other artists who are doing concept albums, and if there was nothing fantastical in it, even the slightest bit of, there's even a genre called slipstream, where everything's as close to reality as possible with one little thing, askew. And I could cover slipstream, literature someday. I could cover, musicals. But like I said, it's got to have a surreal an element, a moment where you're taking reality and you're twisting it to some degree, and a moment where you need to really suspend your disbelief. And that's the thing that I'm always so fascinated by. And then even though I gave up suspension of disbelief as the title of my podcast, I always say at the beginning, this is a show about imaginary worlds, a show about how we create them and why we suspend our disbelief.
Yeah. Well, so how about Rose? Talk about what was the genesis of your podcast, Flash Forward?
Yeah, so I've always sort of been in podcasty land, and I made a couple shows, and then a friend of mine was the editor at Gizmodo, and she asked if I had any podcast ideas, and I was like, oh, boy, do I. And so I pitched her, I think, 4 or 5 different ideas, and we both agreed that this was the best one. And the premise of Flash Forward is that every episode starts with a possible future, so a little radio drama, kind of like a War of the Worlds style, like 5 to 10 minute radio drama that puts you into a future. And then the second part of the show is me talking to experts about what that future might really be like, how we would get there, sort of what the repercussions would be. And it really ranges from, the super unlikely things that are just kind of absurd but fun to think about, like what would happen if space pirates dragged a second moon to Earth and the Earth had 2 moons, which not going to happen. And then we've done things that are really super realistic and terrifying, like, what happens when antibiotics stop working, and that's probably the scariest episode I think we've ever done, and also things that aren't necessarily science specific. So we did an episode, I say we as if there's more than one person working on the show. It just makes me feel like there's it's like, oh yes, we do these things, but so there's an episode about what would it really be like, or what would it really take for California to secede from the United States, or what would it take for everyone in the US, for the US to have a direct democracy where we were all actually voting on everything. So we do sort of a combination of, political, cultural. We did one about what would it be like in a future where gender was just as important to us as hair color. It's like a thing people have, but we don't really care that much about it. So some of them are science, some of them are tech. And I sort of pitched this idea to her, and she was like, yes, let's do it. So I did a pilot season for Gizmodo, and then I kind of went independent and have been doing it since. And it's just sort of a weird little format, but it allows me to kind of touch on the 2 things that I really love, which are the journalism side of things and the reporting, and then also the building of these imaginary worlds. And Imaginary Worlds is a way better title than Suspension of Disbelief. I'm really glad you went with Imaginary Worlds.
Thank you.
But yeah, I talk a lot about these imaginary worlds and sort of world building for the first half of each episode, because I really want to drop people into these worlds and make them sort of figure out what's going on, and then kind of talk about the science and tech and politics and sort of what the reality or sort of unreality of those worlds might be.
I mean, could you say a little bit more about why did you feel it was important to have those audio drama segments at the beginning of each show?
I just thought it would make it more interesting and also sounded really fun. I mean, I think that there's a lot of the idea of the show came out of, I used to cover and I still do cover a lot of tech and science, and particularly in the futurism space. And there's a really great, I mean, sci-fi is so powerful in getting us to imagine things and imagine futures. And obviously, as both Eric and I have talked about a lot on both of our shows, a lot of sci-fi is really telling us a lot about today and sort of like how we feel about our current situations, and sort of it's not usually about the future really. And I just felt like I was seeing all these headlines and I was seeing all of this stuff in the futurism space, and I felt like it was really hard for it was hard for me as a reporter who is an expert in this stuff to figure out like what the hell was going on. You see people who are like, AI is going to destroy us. AI is fine and harmless. Like how are you supposed to parse those things? And to me, it's much more interesting to be faced with decisions sort of in a fictional sense and then sort of get the reporting to back it up than to just be like, here's what you need to know. Because I think there's so much of that out there. I mean, I'm not Vox. There's all these different websites and shows and both radio and podcast and also just online that can explain things really quickly to you. And if you just want an explainer, that's like not like listening to a podcast is not the most efficient way to consume that information. It's probably not necessarily the best way to consume that information. I would argue that the best podcasts are like things that kind of step slightly aside from the explainer and kind of give you a little bit of another thing to think about.
And yet that doesn't stop millions of people from trying to make or thousands of people from trying to make those kinds of podcasts.
I know, it's amazing. It's amazing. But I think that's why, like, like to get like meta talking about podcasts, but I think that's why the Daily actually works really well, is it's not really a news bulletin. Like if you want the news, you can turn on NPR and like get your news in the morning or whatever, or you can just read something, you get your push alerts, whatever. It does this thing where it kind of like, you've probably heard about this, here's like a way to think about it, or here's like a voice you might not have heard, and that's kind of the way I think podcasts are really like situated to be really interesting in sort of helping people sort of take their understanding and awareness and thinking to the next level. And so for Flash Forward, the idea was to really try to put people into positions in this audio drama to have to face these decisions themselves and then kind of back up from there. Because I think so often, and especially in futurism, it can feel really abstract. And it can feel like, oh, well, like if these 9 things happen, maybe we'll get to this 10th thing that you might have to think about. And, that's just like, I even kind of my eyes glaze over on some of those stories. But if you can put those people into that 10th position, into that part where they're like, okay, well, now you have to decide if you are willing to drop your kid off at a school that is only staffed by robots. You know what I mean? Like then we can start to have an interesting conversation from there by just sort of dropping people into that universe. I mean, it's the same reason why sci-fi is so interesting, and the reason that probably we're all interested in sci-fi is it like kind of puts you into these worlds and makes you think like, what would I do in that situation? Like what are the considerations here? And I think that being able to sort of skip ahead to those things using the sort of trope of these audio dramas is the thing that was interesting to me.
Well, like one of the episodes of your show I really enjoyed it's called Unpawful. And the premise is that in the future, animal rights have extended far enough that it's considered wrong for people to keep them as pets, that this is violating the animal's freedom. And you're actually able to find someone today who's advocating for that position. How do you go about finding people like those people who are sort of advocating these sort of unusual causes?
Yeah. I mean, to me, the fun thing about combining these two things is finding those people. And I also try to, as much as possible, find people who have perspectives that you don't normally hear, like on NPR, say. And so, sometimes that's just sort of reaching out. I have some background in like, I used to work in a research lab that got a lot of hate mail from animal rights activists, so I know where to find them.
And just dig through your mail.
Yeah, exactly. All the death threats that I've gotten, like who seems the least scary to me? And so I just sort of got in touch. Actually, the woman Alice is I think the woman's name who I talked to, and she was actually quite nice and laid out her argument. But I do like to give those sorts of people some airspace because they are the ones who are kind of pushing for these futures. I mean, I've talked to people who, want to implant all sorts of technology into their bodies and already have. And, those are people who are sort of outside the quote unquote norm, or people who don't really think necessarily about these things the way that we do. Or, for the episode about California seceding, I asked a person who's a First Nations scholar and sort of someone who knows about Native American rights, like what happens to all the Native American reservations in California if it secedes, right? And that's a question that I wasn't seeing anybody answer. So I try to find sources who can give that little like kind of left turn answer, like the thing that you're like, okay, you've heard all about this topic, but here's the thing you maybe didn't think of, or here's the voice you didn't hear in these conversations. And so finding people to talk has been relatively easy. I think partially I have a background in reporting. Like I am a reporter probably first and foremost. And so that's the fun part to me, is like going and finding these people and trying to get them to talk to me, and also trying to present myself as a person who's not setting them up for some kind of, trick. I think that especially folks like Alice who do these animal rights things, they're so often sort of the butt of jokes that I'm like not interested in making work like that. And so to sort of convince them that no, I actually genuinely want to hear your argument. I might not agree with it, but I am interested in hearing you explain without sort of making you a joke.
Do a lot of people tell you no, that they don't want to appear on the show?
No, it's amazing. Most people say yes. There are some scientists who don't want to do future stuff, which I totally understand. Some of them have had their work misrepresented in the past. Some of them just say that they don't think, they don't want to be part of something that's like talking about fictitious futures. I've had a couple of climate change researchers sort of say that they've been burned a little bit in the past by sort of talking about the future. And I try to make it very clear in my initial when I reach out to people that I'm not asking them, particularly to scientists, I'm not asking them to predict the future. I'm not asking them to endorse anything. I'm not asking them to even say like, hey, this is going to happen. I'm just asking them to show up as an expert to be like, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. And I think I have a pretty good track record with other scientists. So I can also say, hey, here are the other sort of like big name people who appeared on the show and have liked it, But I do try to be very careful with that, because I understand as a scientist, it's always really risky when you start talking about hypotheticals, right? Because your job is not to talk about hypotheticals. Your job is to kind of talk about what you know and what you can test and what you can measure. And so I do try to be very careful and very clear and sort of separate the scientists from the like zany future-y stuff as much as possible, because it's a lose-lose situation if I make them look like they're predicting something that they're not, and then they get mad, and then other scientists don't want to talk to me. So I'm pretty careful about that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, I just want to bring up one of the episodes of Imaginary Worlds I really enjoyed was this one. It's called The Book of Dune, where you talk about the Islamic influences on Frank Herbert's Dune, which is I love that one. I've never heard anyone bring that up before, so I was really fascinated to see that. How did you come up with that idea?
Thanks. Well, it's I think my approach is a little similar to Rose's in the sense that And for me, my where it came from for me was with Studio 360. We would often do that again, going to that American Icon series. It's what does everybody think they know about this? And in the sense of it would just be really boring for me to regurgitate that. And I also try to think of what is the angle people haven't thought of? What have I not seen out there very much? And so, with Dune, people kept asking whether I would do Dune, and I had never read Dune, which I started to become really embarrassed about. Except I'd seen parts of the movie, the terrible David Lynch movie from the 80s, which he had very little control over. But so then, when I started reading it, and again, I was still looking for my angle, and I was doing so many Google searches, and there was so much stuff about the environment with Dune. And the other problem I saw was that so many people had already covered that angle of, like the still suits that the Fremen tribes wear in Dune. There were like scientists in California that were trying to create it, and I listened to the whole public radio story about it. And there's always a sense of if I can't think of how I would do this any differently, I just put it on the shelf, my sort of proverbial shelf. And then I was reading Dune and the word jihad jumped out at me, and I just was kind of startled. And I saw it again and again, and I just thought, whoa, I have never heard anybody talk about this. And then I go into, a deep dive Google search and found people who have strong opinions about it. And then, and short on that, I just find people that have been really helpful in the past. Like the Center for Science of Imagination at the University of Arizona. Those guys are great. So many times when I've been stumped for guests, I go to them and just say, who do you know? Because they have this vast worldwide network of people that they know who are interested in writing about science fiction, talking about science fiction. So that's how that came together.
So those experts for that episode, how long did you interview each of them for?
My interviews are typically 40 to 50 minutes. Or sometimes they go up to an hour, sometimes they're less, sometimes it's pretty quick. And then I just kind of whittle it down to find the tape I like best from there.
And you must be whittling it down to like 4 minutes per person or something out of that hour, right? Or how much of that do you end up using?
Probably more than that. I'd say maybe, well, I was going to say 10 minutes, but that's probably a bit much. I think in the end it's probably about 8 minutes of tape, but it doesn't feel that way. That's the important thing. I mean, I feel like it's one thing you get used to doing in public radio is they'll give you an interview that, the host did, and the interview's about 40 minutes, and they'll just say, we have a 12-minute slot. Could you edit this? And I always thought that was like, it's the weirdest kind of trick that you can pull in public radio to make it look like somebody sat down with the host, had a 12-minute conversation that still felt very satisfying, and got up and said, all right, see ya. And, their coffee that was percolating is now ready. Like it was that quick a conversation to make it still feel full. And that's just something that, you just do over and over and over again till those muscles just become those mental muscles become very refined in how to do that.
Now, see, in this other interview with you, you said that you were able to use the WNYC studio kind of after hours to work on your show. Is that still the case, or do you still have? Oh
no, that when I didn't have to do that anymore when I joined Panoply, and also when I got picked up by Panoply, I left WNYC and because I was able to get advertising money. And I still do part-time work, for a lot of work now for the New Yorker Radio Hour, but I'm not regularly there anymore. But Panoply's got a studio in Brooklyn, and I live in Brooklyn, so it's great.
And so when you get the people on the phone, do you have special, like, great sounding phones or anything? Or is it just like calling them on a normal phone?
I wish. No, I use a lot of Skype tape. And then we have something called a tape sync that we do a lot in public radio, where you talk to somebody on the phone and then you find off a message board a reporter that lives near that person, goes to their house, sets up a microphone, you record yourself, they record them, they send you the tape. Usually it's good, sometimes it's not. It's a big surprise that there was a fan on the background and you're like, why didn't the reporter do something about that? And you're just stuck with that tape. But that's usually what I do. Unless there are certain studios. There's a studio in LA that I've used a lot. That's pretty great. So a lot of the interviews in LA, I'll just have them go in that studio. Or obviously if they're New York based, I can just do it in person.
Yeah. I mean, Rose, when I took a class with you at Union Talks, which is how we know each other, and you said that you would just kind of record stuff in your closet with like this little cheap mic. Is that still your setup?
I have I am actually in my closet right now. Actually.
Yeah.
I do. I have in my apartment. I have a what should be a laundry room, but that does not have a laundry machine in it. And I have hung up curtains and stuff. I have a shotgun mic. When I started out, I was using an extremely cheap Roland, just like little handheld mic to do it. But now I use a Zoom, which is sort of a recorder that I have a shotgun mic, and all told, it's not that much in terms of setup cost. I know people use the Yeti blue mics and stuff like that. I find that, and I'd be curious, Eric, if you think the same thing. I find that like public radio people can be a little bit too precious about sound quality sometimes. I think that like most listeners, as long as you can, follow and hear and it's not, really hard to listen to, will listen to tape that is either phone tape or Skype tape. Or I often will ask the interviewee to record themselves on their smartphones and I'll just talk to them on Skype. And I usually record it back up as well. And I think that, very rarely have I ever gotten complaints from people being like, the sound is bad. I think that there is this thing in public radio where like they want the most pristine sound, which makes sense if you have a big budget and you have studios and you can do that. But I also sometimes feel like it's more important to have a good show. And sometimes I think there's a little bit of like fetishizing nice microphones. I don't know if Eric agrees or not, but
no, I agree. I agree 100%. It's funny because that got so nailed into me, if, God, I remember once we were doing an interview with somebody, and they're at the BBC, but not in London. It was like, in Edinburgh, and the engineer listened to the quality of the mics through other interviews that the BBC Edinburgh had done and be like, not good enough for us. And so the biggest shock for me in my podcast is how nobody has ever said that Skype tape sounded crappy. Like nobody cares.
Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, like, I'm sure that, like, this is also biased, right? The people who really hate it maybe don't send us emails or whatever. But I just feel like when I'm listening, like, if somebody has a really good interview and it's Skype tape, it doesn't bother me. Like, I don't care. Like, I'm interested. I can understand what they're saying. It's not, I mean, I have listened to interviews and I've done interviews where the tape is just, like, unusable. There's, like, crazy noise in the background, or, like, there are moments where you're like, oh, I really, like, cannot understand what this person is saying. But, like, if you can understand what they're saying and it just happens to be a slightly, like, less high quality line, I'm just, like, not going to lose sleep over that.
Well, I've recorded 272 episodes in my closet, so I'm kind of with you on that.
Yeah,
one.
closets underneath blankets, like, you make it work.
It's funny because I've tried that so many times and I feel like I listen and I sound like I'm in a hostage video. I feel like...
Oh, under the blanket?
Yeah, like I feel like I need the presentational thing of having the mic and talking to it. I feel like, I don't know, something about my energy level, I can never get it at the level I want it to be unless I'm sitting in a room like a, old-fashioned, mic sitting there at a table kind of thing.
That's funny. I did have it, like, I had to do an episode from a hotel room, and I, like, left at the last minute because I thought it was the whole thing. And so I had to record at, like, 4:00 in the morning before anybody else had woken up. So I'm under the blanket, and I'm also trying not to be too loud. And I got all these emails from people being like, "Are you okay?" It's like, really, I sounded, because I was, like, trying to be really quiet. And they're like, why are you talking like that? It was not great.
Well, but this issue of sort of standards of radio versus podcasting is kind of occupying my mind a lot recently, because as I was explaining to you guys a little bit in the email I sent you, I feel like sort of when I got into podcasting, it was all amateurs, and science fiction podcasts were all done by writers or fans or people with no radio experience or anything. And I have no radio experience. But I feel like ever since Serial came out that there's been this whole, like, influx of really highly produced, high quality podcasts, and it's not just like not like talk shows like this. It's stuff like you guys do, where there's background music and narration and interviews intercut, and it's all really really highly produced and really professional sounding. And I just wonder, sort of what is the future for podcasts like mine, where it's just like I'm in my closet and I just talk to people and I don't have any background music or anything like that. So I don't know, Rose, what do you, as a fellow closet dweller here, do you fear at all that we're going to be run out of town by these more highly produced podcasts?
I don't.
Or like more highly resourced podcasts?
I mean, resources are always a thing, right? It would be better to have more money, right? To be able to do the show. It would be better to have a nicer microphone, maybe. I mean, it would really be better to be able to, like, hire someone to help, and like Eric, like, I don't have an editor, right? So there's no one who's telling me, like, hey, Rose, maybe don't do a segment on whether Beyonce is a clone. Maybe that's a bad idea. And I'm doing it anyway,
really good,
So like, there's just no one, and I'm also, like Eric, having to, like, hone my editor brain. So I think that would be a place I would spend money. But I mean, I think you said something that said highly produced and high quality, as if those are synonyms. And I actually don't think that they necessarily are. I have heard some very highly produced podcasts that are not good. And I have heard some, like, very low production level podcasts that people love. I mean, The Read, right? The Read is not a highly produced sort of, like, there's no background music or whatever, and they are doing gangbusters, and it's a great show. I think that there are shows that are highly produced, that obviously Serial, obviously S-Town, obviously those both come out of This American Life, which is a public radio show. You have Gimlet. But I mean, even Gimlet has had trouble sustaining a couple of their shows. I truly think, and I know this is, like, a really annoying thing to say, but I do think that, like, quality is the most important in terms of, like, do you have a show that is really well thought out, that is executed really well? And by that, I don't necessarily mean, sounds perfect and has room tone and has, fancy music or whatever. But I just mean that, like, you are delivering exactly what your listeners want. I think that ultimately wins. I mean, The Ringer has all these podcasts, and they are pretty basic in terms of their production value, but people love them because they love the personalities, they love the people behind them. I think that, yes, in some sense, like, as soon as podcasting becomes, like, big business, and as soon as, like, all of these big players enter the space, it does make it harder, right? Because they have the megaphone and we have, like, a chalkboard on the sidewalk, right? And, like, we're competing with people that have funding and that can put their shows. I mean, I saw an ad for a podcast on TV and I was like, what? Like, I can't put an ad on TV. You know, like it sometimes does feel like you're like, you know, the David to their Goliath, right? But I also think that you see enough shows that are doing really well. I mean, Call Your Girlfriend is produced and has a producer, but like they're just talking to each other on Skype. You know, like it's not. I don't think there's no like background music. There's no fancy stuff. And they have a huge audience that's super loyal that comes to live shows and they sell stuff out. I mean, there are all these shows that, you know, I think some of them have the benefit of having started before the big influx of these sort of bigger players. And I think now starting a show is a little bit harder. But at the same time, there are so many podcasts out there and, you know, there are so many people who are like looking for the next thing and looking for the podcast that they want and looking for their sort of person who's going to like bring them into the podcast space that I don't think that it's sort of like, oh, you know what, hang up your jacket, you're done. Like there's no way you can compete. I think it's just a question of, you know, how do you make sure you're reaching the audiences you want to reach and how do you make sure that you're not getting over preoccupied with competing with a Gimlet or a This American Life, and you're making sure that you're doing what you do really well. And I think that I fall into that trap too a lot, where I'm like, oh, well, they're doing this, and maybe I should like do this differently because they're whatever. But that's not what my show is. You know, like my show is a certain thing, and the people who like it really like it. This is not to say that resources wouldn't be great and don't mean that you have a better chance of succeeding. I don't want to like say that, oh, if you just have a good product, people will find it, because that's like just not true. But I do think that like there are all these shows that aren't, you know, highly produced sort of This American Life spinoffs or Serial or don't take 8 months to make and that are doing super well. So I don't think that it's like, you know, the end of days for podcasts like ours.
Well, Eric, I was looking at the reviews for your podcast, and a lot of people mentioned that they heard you on 99% Invisible, and that's how they found Imaginary Worlds. Mm-hmm. How do you get on 99% Invisible?
It's funny because I was talking about.
I want to know too. Tell me, Eric. I want to know.
You do an episode of 99%. I did a couple episodes of 99% Invisible. You know, and I knew Roman a little bit by going to Third Coast, which is the big public radio, although now it's way more than public radio festival that happens in Chicago every year. So. You know, that helped, certainly. And I didn't have a lot of traction in my podcast until then. And basically he'd been listening. I didn't know he'd been listening. And then he just emailed me once and just said, hey, it's Thanksgiving. You know, we don't want to put in a new episode. We all want to take a break this week. So we're just going to put on one of yours. Is that okay? And I'm like, yeah, that'd be great.
Sure.
And so, yeah.
Well, like, Roman, if you're listening, shoot me an email, all right?
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah. And so I was like, yeah, definitely. And it wasn't even an episode I would have even thought of pitching them, because I'd actually been, you know, I was continuing to pitch them stories. And so, but I was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. It was an episode about costume design of superhero movies and TV shows and why they're looking better than they used to. And yeah, it was amazing. My listenership just like quadrupled overnight because of that. And, it's funny because Roman's fans are like really intense. I mean, the people that had been listening, I couldn't get any of them to respond to me. I would be like, you know, I feel like some of my call outs would be like, if anyone's listening, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. and these guys were so like, I mean, they immediately start giving me all this feedback and what, you know, his quote unquote beautiful nerds. They're very, it was funny that they suddenly became my audience, and they're just very dedicated to what they're listening to and talking about it. And that definitely helped get a leg up. And I, you know, I got to say it is a really tough thing to get people to notice your show without that happening. I mean, I'm still jealous of the people that managed to get onto Radiolab, the people that get onto This American Life. I mean, they've had huge bumps when that happens. And I don't see myself ever, you know, getting on those shows anytime in the near future. So, I mean, it's a tough thing, and it's amazing how many people rely on certain podcasters that they consider to be tastemakers, and how important that is. Because I feel like I have been trying everything since then, and was trying everything before that and since then, but nothing, you know, could match just the, you know, a seal of approval from Roman.
I had a similar thing. I worked with Planet Money on an episode, and it was just like, oh, now people are listening to my show. You know, it was just like immediately people who, in a similar way, people who listen to Planet Money are like super fans of Planet Money. And they they contacted me and were like, we need future like vignettes for the show. Like, can you do it in like 4 days? And I was like, oh, Jesus. But yeah, I mean, it was worth the like sleepless nights because it totally made a huge change in the audience numbers.
Yeah, I actually want to go back to something that Rose said earlier, which I just want to add to about, in terms of the professionals coming in. I think the biggest factor, and I totally agree with everything she was saying, but I think another huge factor is how much time do you have to dedicate to your podcast?
Yes.
And I think also if you're a professional, you've put in the years already to get to the point where you can crank out things fairly quickly, which, you've already done your steep learning curve. And so I think that makes a huge difference too in terms of how good a podcast can be, and I agree with her too. It's like production values do not equal good, but I do think the amount of time you can put into it, if you've got the money to do it, if you can get advertising, definitely makes a big difference.
Well, because I've been doing this podcast since 2010, and I've definitely noticed a big change where I used to have a lot of people write reviews and say, like, I'm not really into science fiction, but there were like 10 podcasts back then. So I started listening to this one, and now I really like it. And now I'm a big science fiction fan. I've listened to every episode and I've read all the books. And
that's great.
Yeah, but that doesn't seem to ever happen anymore. As I was saying, since Serial, I feel like it's just, there's just so much more. There's so many more options for people to listen to. And my podcast has been pushed so far down the iTunes charts that that kind of just like random person finding it doesn't happen so much anymore.
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing that podcast people talk about all the time, which is like the discovery problem, right? Like this is like a constant thorn in everyone's side, which is like, how do people find podcasts? And the answer seems to be from other podcasts, basically, because, iTunes, that interface, the Apple Podcast interface is like not super intuitive. It doesn't really help you find things. There isn't the same like Amazon. If you like this, you might also like this, So people just find out about podcasts from other people that they like and they know, so like their friends, and then also from hearing it on other podcasts. So like that's sort of why 99PI pushed a lot of people to Eric, and Planet Money pushed a lot of people to me. Is that like, I mean, even me, like when I think of myself as a podcast consumer, and when I go to find a new podcast, it's usually because I've heard about it on another show, because I'm like listening to that show and I like those hosts and I think they're smart and I think they have good taste. And then they say, hey, we actually really like this other show. And then I go download that show, and like that's sort of how people find stuff. And it's tough, right? Because like there are all of these really great shows that don't have those relationships, or maybe don't have the numbers to make a trade like that sort of a win-win for people. And there are great shows that have like not great audiences because they don't have, or they're having trouble like finding new people because, Apple doesn't really care that much about their interface, and because they're not on these other shows. And it's hard, right? It's really hard to get like these little shows when you're first starting out. If you're not with a network and you're not connected to anybody and you're not, just like any other industry, podcasting is kind of about who you know in some situations, and like the fact that you can like go to Third Coast and meet the people, and then they know you and then they'll email you and whatever it is. I feel like the discovery problem, as cliche as that has become in sort of like talking about podcasts, is kind of a huge actual issue that a lot of people are trying to solve right now. And I don't know how, like, I don't have the answer. Otherwise, I'd have a lot more money and not be sitting in my closet right now.
Well, it seems to me though that this is that this is maybe another advantage to doing a more produced show, that it might get run on 99% Invisible or Planet Money or something. Whereas, like, if I do a hour and 47-minute long interview with James Patrick Kelly, even if it's the best hour and 47-minute long interview with James Patrick Kelly you could ever imagine, that's not going to run on Planet Money. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, but
that's true.
You got shows. Sorry, I was going to say we also have shows like Longform that are doing something very similar.
Yeah,
I love Longform. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing I would say, like, if we're gonna move into advice time, I would say, like, yeah, reach out to, like, shows that you really like and shows that you think are doing a similar thing to you, and, like, say, like, hey, either, I've got this great interview with this person, would you be interested in a collaboration of some kind? Or, like, hey, do you want to swap ads? Like, Eric and I did this, where I was like, hey, do you want to advertise for Flash Forward on your show, and I'll advertise for, Imaginary Worlds on my show? And, like, we did that. And I've heard people be like, oh, I heard about your show on Imaginary Worlds, and like, that's cool. Or like I've done that with Gastropod, where it's like this great podcast about food, and like they hear that, the people found them through me and vice versa. And so, if there are shows that you think are like doing things similar to you and sort of like, you think would make sense to, trade ads or something like that, you can reach out and be like, hey, what would that be like? Or I've had podcasts buy ads on my show if they have a little bit of ad money. If their like numbers don't make quite sense for us to trade, they'll just like spend a tiny bit of money and we give them a discount because they're another podcast or whatever. And so there are ways you can kind of like get yourself in front of those people and figure out how to kind of like leverage those relationships.
That sounds like really good ideas. Maybe I will talk to you guys more about that some other time. I don't want this this episode to get too inside baseball, but let's talk more about your shows, because you do what we do on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy too, is interview science fiction authors. And so I'm curious, maybe Eric, how do you decide whether to interview a science fiction author versus an expert or academic or something like that?
God, it's funny. It's really depends on the subject matter. It's very intuitive in terms of whether, again, it comes to the angle that I'm taking. And if I feel that, do I want to hear an academic or do I want to hear a creative person discussing this right now, or a fan? I mean, I'm actually surprised how often I've included people who are just almost like professional fans, of something, just to get that perspective. So yeah, it really depends. I think the biggest weakness of my show to some extent is because I'm a one-man band. When it comes to like the science fiction authors I interview, they have to be people I'm interested in. I mean, sometimes, so many times my listeners have said, I love this book. You absolutely should read it. And you should have this author on. And I read it and I'm like, And I just, and I stop at a certain point. I'm like, sorry, this person's never going to be on my show unless I have a staff and I have, people who can come on and interview this person instead of me, because it's just not going to happen. So it's very intuitive and very kind of idiosyncratic in that sense.
Which authors would you say you were most excited to talk to?
God, the person I geeked out about the most was Scott Snyder, who writes Batman comics. In fact, I even re-aired that episode recently, or a longer version of it. I was very excited to talk to Kim Stanley Robinson recently for his new book, New York 2140, because I've been a fan of his for a while, and he's just so smart. And it's one of those things where I've heard a lot of interviews with him, and to be there in the room with him. In fact, we had tried really hard he was in Davis, California, and we're trying to work out his schedule the other great thing is that any professor or anyone near a university, very often they have, studios that they'll let you use for free. But I was trying to get him through University of Davis, but he ended up coming to New York. And so I actually got to sit in a room with him and talk with him. And, I was just kind of giddy afterwards.
No, I interviewed him. It was over the phone. I never got to meet him, but no, he's really, really smart and interesting. I would love to talk to him again sometime about both New York 2140 and then also Aurora, which I'm really, really interested in. But how about Rose? Talk about what kind of science fiction authors that you were excited to talk to?
I got to talk to Ted Chiang, which was awesome. And he's like the nicest, weirdest man. In like the best way. I love his work. Yeah, and like I was so nervous because I actually don't get nervous generally for interviews anymore. I feel like I've put in my 10,000 hours of interviews and like I just, I'm like used to it now. But he was one of the people where I was like, I really want him to think I'm smart, like I really want him to think I'm good. And he's like the nicest person and was so smart and so interesting, and he clearly just thinks through things in like a super like generous and insightful and incisive way. And he was great. I also got to talk to Lois McMaster Bujold, who writes like really amazing feminist science fiction that I'm very into. I have talked to Kim Stanley Robinson as well about the climate change and future stuff. He went on a whole like 5-minute like audio love note for dirigibles, which I was really into. So yeah, I mean, like, he's great. I think, similar to Eric, like, I only really talk to people that I'm interested in. And I actually, next week I get to interview N.K. Jemisin, who I'm super excited to talk to. I'm in the middle of the last book of her trilogy, which I'm kind of obsessed with. So yeah, so I just, I'm not in the same way, like I'm not going to interview somebody whose book I didn't like because like I probably didn't finish reading it. And also because, the show mixes sci-fi and journalism, like, I only interview sci-fi people when I think it makes the most sense. So, I mean, there is sci-fi about a lot of the episodes that I've done that I don't end up talking to writers for. But yeah, I mean, those are, I think, the main people who I feel bad. Like, I'm like, they're all my favorite. Everyone's great. But yeah, those are the people who come to mind. It's
funny, actually, speaking of N.K. Jemisin, because I interviewed her about the first book in that series, the fifth season when it came out. And later on, they did a fiction issue of Wired magazine, and they invited her to submit a piece for that. And so I talked to the people who had done that issue, and they were saying that, oh wow, you interviewed N.K. Jemisin way back before she really blew up and got huge. And I was like, oh, like in my world, she was already, she had already blown up and been huge. When I interviewed her.
It's funny. I get the same thing with, like, especially because I interview a lot of, like, people who've written books in the 80s, like Mary Doria Russell and, like, other people like that, and, like, who haven't necessarily written something big since then. And I'll get notes from people being like, I had never heard of this person. And I, like, read all this stuff, and I was like, she's won, like, 5 Hugo Awards. Like, she's not like an unknown person, but, like, yeah, like, they're not, like, in the current sort of, like, world of sci-fi. So it is nice to, like, I'm sure you get this a lot more than I do, David, like, people discovering books based on, like, your stuff.
Right. And it's really hard for me to gauge just what percentage of our listeners are familiar with the authors. Like, I really wonder, just how many people just listen to these long interviews and have no idea who the person is going into it.
I did a whole episode about Octavia Butler, and my biggest concern was people would be like, oh, really? Discovering Octavia Butler in 2016? Welcome to the party.
Yeah.
And I could not believe how many people were like, I have never heard of Octavia Butler.
It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much for introducing me to her. I was shocked at how many people wrote me and told me they'd never heard of her.
It is amazing. I feel like post-election, there's been a lot of like, have you heard of this person named Octavia Butler? And I'm like, what? Like, like yes, like they're like, oh my God, Parable of the Sour. Like, I'm like, yeah, guys, hi. Like,
Yeah. Well, also too, I think Ava DuVernay is going to be adapting I forget the name of the book. It has the title seed in it. But anyway, she's adapting one of her books.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. It's going to be really good.
Well, that's interesting, Eric, that you mentioned feedback. Do you have any other feedback from listeners that you get that really stands out in your mind?
I'm honestly stunned at how many times people tell me they binged the whole show. It's just incredible. I mean, I've done like well over 70 episodes, and I'm always so curious what they were doing. They were taking a road trip. I get a lot of painters too, will sometimes say, like, I was, and I was the same way in animation. I mean, I remember nothing I hated more than having to do perspective drawings, and sometimes I'd have to spend 3 days doing that. I'd listen to an entire, like, Charles Dickens audiobook because that's all there was to listen to back then. But the binging really kind of amazes me, and I mean, it happens often enough now that I'm not amazed anymore by it, but it still on some level kind of amazes me that the dedication people have towards listening to podcasts, as if you're like, I just binged on The Wire, or I just binged on Buffy.
Right. I mean, I just had somebody sign up for Patreon just an hour or so ago who said in their message that they've been listening since 2010. I mean, the stuff like that just blows my mind. And these are, hour-long episodes that are weekly or bi-weekly. So that's a lot of stuff to listen to. Yeah.
The other thing I think is amazing to me is the global nature of podcasting, because at Studio 360, we were a national show, but most of the feedback we got tended to be from the Northeast. And of course, when I did a lot of stuff for WNYC, it was all very, very local. And it would be more like my cousin would say, I was in the car and I heard your voice. But I mean, to get, comments from, Ireland and, Australia, it's just, that I never get tired of being amazed by that, even though it's, of course it's global.
Yeah. How about Rose? What kind of feedback do you get?
People hate my voice.
I'm right there with you.
Do you really get that?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, but I mean, like, I feel like if you're like a woman on the radio, like, you just get that all the time, which is, you get used to it. No, the feedback that I like the best, I got one recently that I like maybe teared up at, where someone was like, your show is the reason that I like left my job and went back to grad school to like study future studies. And I was like, what? Like stuff like that. But I think the main thing that I really like to hear is people say, like, I had never thought about that thing that way. Right. Like, that's the thing that I like the best. because that is kind of the point of the show, is to like give people like mental models, basically. So when they encounter, two giant tech bros fighting about whether AI is going to destroy us, they like know the questions to be asking or sort of know how to think about it. And to have people be like, oh, now I get it. Or like, oh, now I like understand how to think about this, or even just like what questions to be asking. That's the kind of feedback that I like the best. I also I love hearing people, same thing with like the binging thing. People will be like, I listened to all of the episodes, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot of time. But I appreciate it. Obviously, I will take every listen, but like, yeah, people will be like, I listened to all of them. The funny thing that I get is, so the show does range from like super absurd things that just like are never going to happen. Like everyone wakes up and they're face blind. And like, how do we then like adapt our society to people who can't recognize each other's faces? To the ones that are super serious and like very sort of grounded in reality. And I have found that listeners are split basically 50-50, where if they have an opinion, some of them like, a lot of people like both, but some people, there's like a group of people who like hate the silly ones and are just like, I don't care about that. Like, that's not going to happen. Like, knock it off. And then there are people who hate the serious ones because they're like, I'm listening to this for entertainment. Like, I don't want to be sad and scared, So, like, it is interesting to hear from those people. And I'm always going to just do both. Like, I'm not going to really change what I'm doing based on that. But, like, there are definitely those two camps. I think the vast majority of people like that we do both. But there are definitely two camps of people who are like, knock it off with your like nonsense silly things, and then on the flip side being like, let's not do antibiotic resistance. That's like a little bit too real.
That's interesting. We have a similar thing over here in Imaginary Worlds where we sorry, I just heard you say we again.
Yes, me and the team.
Because I do have a similar thing where I tend to have my what my old editor at Studio 360 used to call my think pieces, where I have some big thing that I'm trying to explore, like how was the internet predicted through science fiction over the last 100 years? And I have a lot of people where you don't get to know them that much or that well because it's all about just advancing different parts of this argument. And then sometimes I'll just do an interview with, like Lisa Hannawalt, the artist who's,
I love that one.
Is a designer of, BoJack Horseman. And it's just it. It's just a whole episode of me interviewing her. And some people really love that. They really love the creative process part. And the other people who really are like, I listen to podcasts to learn things. I don't care about some interview show. It's interesting. It's almost like different parts of their brain, lights up and they get really, really excited. And then the people that get so excited about the big thinky pieces just utterly disappear. If, when I have these just kind of creative process kind of one-on-one interviews and vice versa.
But that is one nice thing, right, about like running your own show and having a podcast is that like, at Studio 360, you have segments, right? And you have like the A, B, C, you've got your like blocks. You've got what you like, first we do this, then we do this. And you have like your aha moments and you have your like little segments that all have their own thing and they each like have to do a thing. And whereas on the podcast, like if you want to do an interview, you do an interview. And if you want to do the big idea thing, you do the big idea thing. And like, you can just do both and it doesn't really matter. Like no one is like checking and no one is making you say like, well, last week we did that, so we can't do it again this week. And, you obviously, probably balance them out. So you're not doing like 9 interviews in a row or whatever. But like you have the freedom to kind of do both of those things. Whereas at a public radio show, you might not have that freedom.
Yeah, and I've done a couple of radio dramas, which has been incredibly divisive as well.
Would you ever consider, Rose, maybe setting up different feeds, like because I do so many different kinds of things on my show, I do wonder sometimes if I should have, like, here are the video game episodes, here are the movie reviews, here are the author interviews, you could have, like, happy, or, like, flash forward goofy and flash forward serious, and people at least, if they're only interested in one or the other, they would at least know which ones were which.
I've thought about a couple of things, but I think to me, and this is just sort of my like slightly political view, is that like I do want to kind of force people to sit with certain things, even if they're like, oh, because a lot of my audience is like tech people, and it's largely male, and so I do want to have some episodes where they have to think about, like privilege and like the way that tech is implemented like in unequally and like those kinds of things. And I don't really want them to be able to opt out of that and vice versa. Like sometimes like, if I want people to just have a good time, and also even in the silly episodes, we do talk about like serious things. The idea is to use kind of a silly premise to kind of explain something or to explore this like thing that I've been thinking about, None of them I think are totally just like, for shits and giggles. You know, like they all have a point. I'm not just like, you know, these episodes take a lot of time to produce, so I do try to like think about what I'm doing in them. But so I'm hesitant to give people the opt out because in a lot of ways I do kind of want them to think about futures that they don't want to think about. You know, like there are a lot of people who would love to be able to just shut off the part of their brain that has to think about inequality or has to think about, you know, the ways in which the future might not just make everything better, you know, and I don't want to shove that down people's throats. But at the same time, I'm not super interested in like giving people an easy out. If they decide they want to skip that episode, that's totally their prerogative. But I'm not going to like set up a whole separate feed for people who just like only want happy futures or only want, you know, quote unquote non-political futures, which I think is silly because the future is inherently political. And everything we do and like all the decisions we make, you know, impact people. But I have thought about setting up separate feeds for like different kinds of things. So like I would love, you know, I have all these interviews that I've done for these shows. And sometimes, you know, I only use 2 minutes of an hour-long interview because it doesn't really fit the rest of the theme of the show. So I've thought about doing like a separate feed that's like the future of blank. And it's just like little, you know, 15-minute like cut down interviews with these people who kind of only got a tiny segment on the show or something like that. But it would only be for that kind of thing where it's like it's really a separate product than it is for like themes within the same kind of flash forward world.
Right, that's really interesting. Actually, I just took the Union Dogs podcasting class again a week or so ago, and some people were suggesting that maybe I should have a like short version of my show. So there's the, you know, hour and 47-minute long interview with James Patrick Kelly, which I think the whole thing is great. But then maybe I could edit down like a 15-minute version or something for people who only want 15 minutes of that.
I mean, I think it's like, you know, it depends on what you also want the show to be, right? Like there are people who, I mean, The Read is a 90-minute show often, and like it's long, you know, and people sit through the whole thing. So I think it also like you have to kind of think about like what is the value proposition, to use like a tech term here, for your show, and like what do you want it to be doing? And if you want to be doing over an hour long interviews with people, you should do that. You should like cutting an hour and however many minutes long interview down to 15 minutes takes a lot of work to do it well. And if you don't like, if A, it's not like pleasurable to you, and B, like you don't feel like it's really doing the thing that you want your show to be doing, I don't feel like it makes sense. Listen, haters are going to hate. And I feel like you should just do what you want because it's like life is short and podcasting doesn't make you that much money.
Yeah, that's true. I'm actually curious, have you guys had anything just go badly wrong? Like any like interviews just like fell through or anything like that? Or like, you know, episodes that got deleted by accident or anything like that? Eric, any catastrophic things like that?
God, yeah, but I find them so traumatic. I push them out of my brain. So I think I need to think for a moment as to what I want to dredge up from the archives of my head right now to off the top of my head. You have anything, Rose?
I had a moment during the first season. We did an episode, my team and I, I did an episode about this proposal that these philosophers came up with that basically said that in order to combat climate change, we should genetically engineer humans to be different. So we should give them better night vision, and we should make them smaller, and we should give humans an allergy to meat. And this was like a real paper that was published by these philosophers. And in the episode, I sort of talked to a couple of geneticists and a couple of ethicists about the ethics of these proposals. Turns out very unethical. And basically sort of roundly debunked this idea, both for being extraordinarily difficult and also being like bordering on eugenics. And sort of this idea, like we sort of dug into this idea of like, why does it seem more reasonable to literally genetically engineer humans than to just like turn the lights off more? You know, like it seems like weird that we're like reaching for this like crazy tech solution. And so I did this episode and it went out, and I got a text message a couple days later from a friend that said, hey, you were just on, like, they just talked about your show on the Rush Limbaugh show. Apparently Rush Limbaugh thought that I was literally proposing this, like that he like he saw the headline and he like went on this whole rant about how like liberals are trying to genetically engineer our babies to combat climate change. And it was like this whole thing, and he went on this like whole rant about it on his show. And I was like, oh, fuck, like this is really bad. And it was actually really interesting because I was waiting for the like to be inundated with Rush Limbaugh listeners, right? Like to my email or to like Twitter or whatever. And I got nothing. Like not a single person got in touch with me, which was really weird. But I did feel like weirdly bad because like, I mean, fake news is like a real problem. And I was like, I genuinely like, I don't want people thinking that this is a real thing. Obviously he didn't listen to the episode. He didn't even read the like associated blog post that made it very clear that we were like not endorsing this plan. He just read the headline. But yeah, that was probably the worst thing, where at first I thought it was funny, and then I started really thinking through, and I was like, oh no, this is bad. Like, this is really bad.
You know, so I had something slightly similar where, you know, one of the early episodes I did was it was an episode about Peter. It was an episode about Captain Hook, who I always thought got a raw deal in Peter Pan. And so then I just had about halfway through the episode. It was a very straight up episode. I interview an academic, and you know, who studies and writes about, you know, children's literature. And then I have an actor playing Captain Hook drunk dial me, and we had this whole long conversation. And at that point, it's funny, I didn't have that many listeners back then, but some people were really, really confused and thought that this was real. This was, you know, that some drunk person had called me, and I believed him, which I couldn't really believe. It just seemed so strange to me. And then much later, like at least a year later, probably more, I did an episode with Here Be Monsters. We did a collaboration, which was set in the world of H.P. Lovecraft, where it was a it was basically a fake episode, which starts out realistic. In fact, we did interview, I think, some kind of scientist, but eventually it got so ludicrous that I was interviewing H.P. Lovecraft's brain in a jar, and who was making
I love that episode.
Thank you. Who was making anti-Semitic comments towards me. And it was, I could not have been more clear at the beginning. This is going to start out real, but it is a radio drama. In the description on social media, in the description on your phone, it says, this is a radio drama. And I could not believe how many people wrote me and just said, I completely forgot. Like, it was so believable that I forgot, and I'm really angry at you for misleading me. And somebody said, you know, I listened to podcasts to get information, and I didn't get any information from this, which is funny because I feel like you actually could learn a lot about H.P. Lovecraft from this episode. Yeah. It's just, you know, done, you know, indirectly. But then it was interesting because a lot of my listeners in England loved it. Like, they had no problem immediately jumping on, oh, okay, this is fake, you know, because there's just so much more of a tradition of radio drama over there. But I was shocked at how divisive that episode was. And so I've been working with The Truth lately, this radio drama podcast. And so
good.
Yeah. And so the first episode that I did with The Truth that I want to put on my podcast, I mean, I did like a whole 15-minute interview with Jonathan Mitchell, who creates The Truth, about The Truth. I mean, I felt like I had to set it up so clearly as to what was going to happen. And Jonathan was like, don't you want to just jump it in and, you know, throw people for a loop? And I was like, no, that's a really, really bad idea.
Last time.
Yeah, I've done that twice already. And it worked. I mean, it was like I got no, you know, it couldn't have been more clear, you know. And even when I went, I was even going to come back from my commercial break and just start playing it. But I was like, no, I got to set it up. Okay, everybody, here we go. Here's the episode I did. You're not going to hear my voice in it. And then I played it, and that went over well. But it's funny, people just, you know, and Jonathan was even saying to me, he's like, well, you know, it's almost like, I mean, he's like, people want consistency. You know, his podcast is all radio dramas. And he's like, but imagine if one week I instead interviewed a scholar about radio dramas. People would have been really upset because it's not what they're regularly expecting from the Truth. And so, you know, it's funny because, I mean, you have your own podcast, you have your own sandbox, you want to play in it. But yeah, and there are some podcasts I love where they throw things around all the time. Here Be Monsters, Love and Radio. But I guess in those podcasts, people are used to to being surprised because every single episode is so different than the last one. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I have to do that the intro of Flash Forward every time says like, okay, we're going to start with a radio drama. And I've had like longtime listeners be like, yeah, we get it. And I'm like, no, you don't understand, because if I don't say this, people will. And I've had this happen. People think that the expert interviews are fake too. and they've been like emailing me being like, wait, is this a real person? I'm like, yes, these are real experts. Like, these are real people. I did not hire actors to pretend to be scientists. Like, this is like, and use like real scientists' names. It was like, but yeah, so like longtime listeners have been like, okay, we get it. And I just am like, every time I say it, I'm like, we're going to start with a radio drama. Then we're going to talk to real experts, like, which seems so silly, but like, yeah, if you don't say it, like people get really confused.
Well, I mean, Eric, when you're talking about Here Be Monsters and the Truth and stuff, are there any other kind of science fiction oriented podcasts that you listen to that you would recommend to people?
You know, it's funny. I don't listen to a lot of sci-fi podcasts. I listen to podcasts purely based on how they're put together. Like I listened to 30 for 30 because I knew Rose and a mutual friend of ours, Jules, was working on this, and I'm so not a sports fan, but I'm like, there's great talent on this show, and I want to hear, so I'm listening to Rose's thing about the mountain climbers, and I'm like, how did Rose put this together? I want to know, and that's kind of how I listen to podcasts. So I'm actually fairly agnostic in a weird way about the subject matter, and I look at shows based on how they're put together differently. I mean, I'm a huge fan of You Must Remember This, and because I think what Karina Longworth does is so difficult in terms of she just does a lot of research and she talks for an hour and then does like a 10-part episode of her talking for essentially 10 hours, and it's mesmerizing. But then, I listen to, like I said, I listen to Love and Radio a lot. Heavyweight with Jonathan Goldstein it's like for different things. Like if I want to know how do you tell a story personally, I'll listen to Heavyweight. How do you want to tell a story from a much more sideways, where you don't even have a host there? It's Love and Radio. Reply All, I'm so fascinated by the banter and the way they edit the conversation that the two of them have based on the research that they do and the little surprises that happen within an episode. To me, I never get tired of that. So that's kind of how I listen to stuff.
How about Rose? Do you listen to any science fiction podcasts?
Yeah, I'm similar to Eric in that, like, I mean, one of the curses of working in audio is that you don't have a lot of time to listen to audio. In my old job, I used to do science, and I could, be looking at a microscope and listen all day, right? And now I'm listening all day to my own work, and so I don't have a lot of time, and also sometimes, like, I don't have a lot of emotional energy to listen to other things, because in the same way, I'm, like, listening to something and I'm thinking, like, oh, cool, they made this decision. Like, why did they do it that way? Like, why do you think they did this? There's a kids podcast called The Alien Adventures of Finn Caspian. It's like a little kids like audio drama, and it's really cute. It's super delightful. I like that one a lot. But I listen to The Truth. I love The Truth. And like they're often sort of sci-fi-ish. I think, he's kind of like veered towards, I think when that show started, it was sort of more traditional, like straight ahead radio drama. And I think he's veered more towards sci-fi just because it's like easier to kind of build like weird little fictional things.
Well, actually in your class, Rose, he played us a OK Dick adaptation, which was spectacular. Yeah.
I mean, he's like, honestly, like I would kill to work with him. He's so smart. I actually have a pitch I want to send to him. I have an idea.
Oh, you should. They need, they're looking for more writers still.
Oh, cool. Okay, yeah, I have an idea for something that I think will be fun. I have it like half written, and then I was like, maybe I should ask someone who actually knows what they're doing. I listen to, I love, this is not around anymore, but Mystery Show was a show from Gimlet that was alternatively like infuriating and sort of just delightful. Like there are some episodes that I like think is like the perfect, like the belt buckle episode I think is maybe the most perfect thing I've ever heard. And then there are other episodes where I'm like, I hate this so much, but like it's so interesting, just like the decisions that she makes and sort of how she does it. And she's so smart about structure and stuff like that. I just finished listening to 36 Questions, the podcast musical.
Mm-hmm. I listen to that too.
It's a 3-part musical, which is I was skeptical because I'm not like a big musicals person, but it's great. I also think We Must Remember This is like deceptively brilliant. It seems so simple, and she's so good. But in terms of sci-fi podcasts, I listen to Imaginary Worlds. And David, I listen to your show.
I should say that, yeah.
David, I do listen to your show if there's an author that I know. And so I did listen to your Kim Stanley Robinson interview from a while back, actually as prep to listen to interview him on my show. Oh, cool. But yeah, like if there's somebody that I'm like, ooh, I like that person, I'll listen. But that's how I listen to most podcasts. Like I don't listen to really anything regularly, but if there's a topic that jumps out at me where I'm like, ooh, I like that. Like, that's an interesting thing to me. I will grab that episode and listen to it. But yeah, I'm sort of like, I sort of graze a lot, and I sort of feel like I should be up on what everyone's doing. So I listen to I listen to one episode of a lot of shows.
Yeah.
Just to kind of get a sense of like what's out there. But my like guilty pleasure is The Read, which is like not at all about sci-fi. But yeah, I mean, like, there's just so much out there that I find, especially with my like limited listening time, it's really hard to. This is so like lame to be like, I don't actually listen to podcasts. Please listen to my podcast. You know.
It's funny. My guilty pleasure is Rona and Beverly.
Oh my God, I love that show.
I saw them live. So they're two
so
actresses from Boston. I'm from Boston, and they play characters that are about at least 20 years older than themselves. Yeah. And they put on these very thick Boston accents. And what I find so fascinating is that they've created they have these imaginary families they have real families, but because their characters are so much older than they actually are, they have these characters that we've never seen or heard. They're supposedly their kids. And they do the improv thing where one of them will say something totally absurd about the other one's children, and the other one will have to justify why what they said was absolutely true, even if it's completely inconsistent with what's been established as essentially the canon of Rana and Beverly. And then they do interviews with real people in character. And like, to me, it is an imaginary world that they've created. And I think I find that show endlessly fascinating.
It's so funny. Do you ever listen to Hello from the Magic Tavern? That's another one that comes up, which I like a lot, which is fun.
Actually, at the podcasting class last week, people were saying, I haven't listened to it yet, but they were saying there's a new This American Life episode out that's about Afrofuturism.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was exciting. They don't do science fiction very much, so it was cool. I mean, it eventually becomes... It veers further and further away from science fiction as they go through the episode, but... yeah.
Huh. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. But yeah, it was kind of cool to see that This American Life was doing something like that. I also just wanted to mention that Tor Labs is starting up some new science fiction podcasts.
Really? Steal the Stars, right? Is that one of them?
Yeah. So I haven't listened to it yet, but it says it's scripted by Mac Rogers, the award-winning playwright and writer of the multi-million download The Message and Life After.
Oh my goodness, I believe I've advertised both of those on my podcast. Because of their panoply. Yeah. I actually did really like those a lot. So it was an easy thing to advertise.
Oh, have you guys heard Limetown? That's the other one I was going to say.
Yeah, I like Limetown.
I liked Limetown. It was like almost great. I was like, there are moments where I was like, yeah, drop me out of it, you know? But I think audio drama is really hard to like sustain over a long period of time.
I think there's not enough improv in a lot of audio drama. I mean, I feel like that's when it sounds the most fake. I think there are moments in Limetown that I felt that way, where I just even in the Message as well. I just wanted them to shake it up a little bit and not stick so closely to the script, because audio is such an intimate medium, and you can hear when someone's lying, you know, in audio, and you can certainly hear a bad or a flat read of a line that just was a little bit clunky, and then just a little bit of improv I feel like would add so much to these shows.
It's such an unforgiving medium for that kind of thing, because like you can't cover it with pictures, you can't cover it with action or like music. You know, you just like if it's not quite right, it just drops you out of it so quickly.
Yeah, and that's what working with Jonathan is like on The Truth. Is just, you know, he records like 5 times as much audio as he needs per episode, and even still, if he never gets a good reading of a line, as important as it may have been to the script, he's like, he will not include it.
Wow.
That's why he's so good.
I thought it was interesting, Eric, that you actually you started playing Dungeons and Dragons for your podcast. Are you going to do any more kind of embedded journalism kind of stuff like that?
Oh, do you have any? Well, first of all, I'm still playing with that same D&D group almost 2 years later. But do you have any suggestions of where I should embed myself?
I'll have to think about that. Actually, that's interesting though that you're still playing with that group.
Yeah, so my character is a sorcerer, and he's a halfling. It was just a lot of people, suggested to me that like you should cover D&D. It's really, you know, and I had noticed a lot of articles where, you know, look, this famous author, you know, started out playing D&D. This famous playwright, you know, says D&D was this great creative gym for their mind as a kid or as a teenager. So I thought it'd be fun. I thought there were these great sound possibilities of me learning how to play and rolling dice and all that. And like the last day that I was there, and I thought it was the last day I'd ever played D&D. There was this young woman who in her 20s at the time. But she was an amazing dungeon master. And they talk about the theater of the mind when you're playing D&D. And she was just so... And we just played with her last Friday, and we hadn't played in a while, and I just came home and I was saying to my wife, I forgot how good she is. I mean, she's like a one-woman theatrical company. And I just was... And we had great chemistry with me and like 3 other guys who were there. And I was telling her, I was like, that was exactly what I was looking for. And so she's like, well, I have private groups, so you guys want to form a private group? So yeah, our fellowship has been going on for about 2 years now, and it's been, I've been considering doing a follow-up episode because what's happened in that world with our characters is truly epic.
Oh, that would be cool. It's funny, I don't know if you've seen how many podcasts there are where it's just people recording their Dungeons and Dragons sessions, and they are incredibly popular. Like, I cannot even believe how popular they are.
Yeah, Adventure Zone is like so popular, right? That's the McElroys?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one too where they film it, but they have animation as well. I can't remember the name of that one. It's on YouTube.
Oh, I don't know that.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking of, because you said that you learned to play D&D at the Brooklyn Strategist, where I've been there a couple times, and I have thought about maybe doing an episode where I interviewed some people who own those kind of gaming stores, because I'm really fascinated about what it takes to keep a store like that in business. It seems like one of those dream jobs, like having your own bookstore or movie store or comic book store or something.
That place is thriving too. I mean, it's and in fact, one of the guys I interviewed there, Tim, I think went off to another competing gaming shop. It's incredible how popular they are, and it's intergenerational too. They have, there's kids and teenagers, but there's a lot of adults that are there. I'm definitely not the oldest person in the room, although I'm close to it.
Yeah, there's a store like that. I live in Astoria. There's a store like that here called The Geekery. I'll just put in a good word for it. I've gone to some events there and really had a good time. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, Eric, I just had a really interesting conversation with a guy who designs board games. And like just generally like how, like, I guess I'd never really thought about like all the work that goes into designing board games. And he had like some really interesting stuff to say about just like, yeah, like how you basically have to build this like 2D and I guess 3D with the pieces and stuff world that people live in and then play in, and like what makes a good board game. Because like, some games are too complicated and some are like too simple because they're boring, and like how do you strike that good balance? I just thought it was really interesting the way he like talked about something that I guess like of course people have to design board games, but it had not really occurred to me like that was a job. But yeah, I feel like board games are fascinating to me. And I guess D&D is not quite a board game, but
yeah, no, I feel like there's a lot to go into there. I mean, there's so much more to explore that I even the 2 years I've been doing it, I feel like I got to the game shop and I was so daunted by how many games I did not know existed that people were really into, and yet I've yet to really delve into it. It's funny though. Frankly, I'm way more fascinated by all the Hasidic Jews that go there on dates. That's who I really want to talk to. It's really weird. It's a big thing for a lot of Hasidic Jewish courtship in Brooklyn is to go to game shops.
Yeah, that sounds like a fascinating episode. Yeah. Actually, when
that
Rose
sounds like a This
was
American Life story.
Yeah.
When Rose was actually mentioning the boards and stuff, there was this documentary, I think it was called The Dwarfenauts, but it's about this guy, and he lives in New York City, and he makes kind of like dungeon blocks, like kind of Lego type dungeon blocks that you can build dungeons for your D&D campaigns. And he's a really interesting character. So I would recommend checking that out. It's funny,
our Etsy store for everything.
Yeah, it's funny. Our D&D group is for our dungeon master for her 30th birthday. She wanted to do one of those escape the room thing. It was a D&D themed escape the room, and it was amazing how useless I felt without any of my magic powers. I was like, normally I just shrink myself down and go under the door.
So you didn't have any abilities. It was just like a medieval style dungeon you were trying to escape from or something?
Yeah, those escape the room things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was it was like a D&D type themed escape the room. Except for the part where we got to use any magic, which was like, okay.
Was that in New York?
Yeah, in Brooklyn.
Oh, cool.
Everything's in Brooklyn. You can find anything in Brooklyn.
Exactly.
All right, cool. So, guys, we're pretty much out of time. So, I don't know. Does anyone have any final thoughts? Any upcoming plans for your podcast or anything cool to mention?
I want to ask you guys a question, if you don't mind. I have a task that has been given to me by someone to watch a bunch of sci-fi TV shows that I haven't had a chance to watch. What is the best sci-fi related TV show? Broadly, interpreting sci-fi broadly. So, what should I be watching?
I like The Expanse.
Okay.
Yeah, The Expanse is good. That was my summer discovery. I mean, I loved Fringe. I feel like that. I don't know if you watched Fringe during its time, but it's so hard for a show to actually come to completion and be good from beginning to end, and it just kept developing in interesting ways.
Cool.
Have you seen Black Mirror?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Orphan Black.
That's the other one that's on my list too. I feel like I've heard so much about how impressive it is that I think it's Tatiana Maslany who like plays every character.
Yeah, she's
unbelievable. Tatiana Maslany, yeah, she's amazing. Yeah. The show it's excellent, and it gets like a lot of these shows around the third season or so, it gets kind of wonky, and then they just had to decide, okay, when are we going to end this? What is the end? What is the end game of this entire series? And even she, I think, was like, I'm getting a little tired of playing 12 characters in episodes. So,
sounds exhausting.
Once they made that decision, the show got infinitely better, and the fourth and fifth season, it just completed a few months ago. The entire series, it's excellent.
Yeah. No, that's on my list. I just got caught up on Rick and Morty, which I'm enjoying.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah. I forgot to mention, actually, Rose, you did a Handmaid's Tale podcast, right?
I did do a Handmaid's Tale podcast, yes. Yeah, I did like one of those sort of TV recap podcasts for Handmaid's Tale, which was, I don't know if you guys have seen it. It is very good, but like tough to watch sometimes because it's really depressing.
Yeah, that's why I didn't watch. It just looked, I mean, I already watched Man in the High Castle, which is great, but it's really, I'm like, there's only one I want to shoot myself after every episode of these I can take.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like Handmaid's Tale got so much press for being so like, relevant and da-da-da, even though when they started producing, obviously, like they didn't think it was going to be this relevant. And I think a lot of people assumed that was going to help them. And I actually think it kind of hurt them because I've talked to so many people who are friends of mine who like love Margaret Atwood, read the book, like would be the target audience for this. And they were just like, I just like can't watch this. Like I like the day-to-day is so awful right now that like I can't, like I just don't want to watch this.
I think Man in the High Castle may suffer from the same problem, actually. Although now I'm hooked on it. So, but I wonder if I hadn't started watching it, if I'd want to watch it right now.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll do any more TV review podcasts like that?
It was really interesting. It was the first thing I've ever done like that, where you just like show up and talk, and then basically your conversation is put out into the podcast. I mean, I've done interviews like this before, but when you're the guest, it's a little bit different than when you're kind of the host or the person who's sort of talking sort of for the show. And I had a co-host for the show, but like Laura June Topolsky, who was really, really smart, and we had very different perspectives on the show. But it was very interesting. You know, when you don't really get to edit stuff, or you aren't writing a script, it's not a scripted thing. If you make a mistake, people will tell you, or whatever it is. And I just feel like it was really, I'm someone who prepares a lot. I'm like a over reporter. I like read all the books. I make all the prep docs. Like I'm very prepared. And so I prepped a ton for every episode, because I would like watch it, and then I would be like, okay, well, I want to talk about like this element. And I would come with this like 5-page Google Doc, and Laura would just show up and just like talk. And which is great. I'm not saying that like that was I think there were just different methods, but it was really stressful for me, because I was like, oh, well, like I'm just talking, and then whatever I say is going to go out to the world, and about this show. And so I was actually super nervous about it. And it took me a couple of episodes, I think, to really get into a groove, because I was so worried about saying the wrong thing or getting something wrong, or if I had an idea, I didn't want to just say it. I would want to like think about it, and then like maybe Google and see if anyone else has written about it, and you can't obviously do that. But I will say that we got a message from the sort of showrunner for the show, And he was like, hey, I like your podcast. And I was like, what?
Oh, wow.
And then I was like, hey, would you be willing to be on? And so he came on to the show at the end of the season. He came on and we did an interview with him. And he told us that he had listened to every single episode, which was terrifying. But also he liked it. So hopefully, I don't think we sounded that stupid. But he was, I mean, I think it's for him, like, it's nice to have people who are really attentive watchers. Like I watched every episode more than once to like make sure I got everything. And to sort of notice things and talk about things. And it was really interesting to hear him talk about the way that he thought about the show, being like a straight white man, like being the showrunner for this show that's sort of about all these other things, and his decision-making process. But yeah, it was interesting, but it's so different from what I do at Flash Forward. It actually took me a couple of episodes to really feel comfortable doing it.
That's interesting. And then, of course, we've got Star Trek Discovery coming up pretty soon.
Yes. I'm excited about that.
I'm very curious about that. It's funny because I think the trailers look great, but then all the like word of mouth behind the scenes is pretty rough in terms of like creative differences and everything. So I'm very curious.
But that was the case for Westworld too, right? Like people like they had to stop production and blah blah blah. And like, I mean, I had its flaws, but like I thought it was a great show.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So, guys, we are all out of time, so I think we're going to need to wrap things up
I diverted us to TV. Sorry.
no, it's
good.
It's good.
I just want to say that I said that Rosa's thing on 30 for 30 was about mountain climbers, and I realized, no, they actually were going into the Arctic, so sorry about
close enough.
I didn't sound too inaccurate there.
No, you're fine. Don't worry. Thanks for listening to it. That's all I care about.
It was cold. I remember it was very cold.
It was very cold.
That's the hazards of this kind of show. Just whatever you say, mountain climbers, it's going out to the world.
That's what terrifies me about doing these kinds of things. I make mistakes like that all the time. Yeah.
Everybody does.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone makes mistakes. Our audience will forgive you.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Don't at me. Whatever you do, I don't care.
All right, great. So we've been speaking with Rose Eveleth, host of Flash Forward, and Eric Molinsky, host of Imaginary Worlds. So, guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Rose Eveleth and Eric Molinsky for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Chadney Everett, Timothy Jones, and Adam Smith, who all just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.